Hello friends and welcome to lesson 5 of unit 2 of business environment and Indian economy. Today we are going to talk about deficit financing and budget analysis. In detail we'll be covering 5 topics in today's lesson. Number 1 would be what is deficit financing? What are the indicators of deficit financing? What are the effects of deficit financing? And what are the remedial measures which you can use to reduce the deficit. And finally, we'll try to analyze the union budget for 2020-21. So let us start. And anyone who can give me some idea about deficit financing, you can use that for your personal budget or for the budget of the country as a whole. So deficit is nothing but when you are spending more than you make. That means your expenditure is more than the revenue. So this is the time when we are making the budget. So this is the budgetary situation when we see that what we are planning, the expenditure is going to be more than the revenue. If that is the case, if I want to spend more, so from where the money will come, which is showing as a deficit. So we can finance that excess expenditure with some outside resources, and these can be either printing of currency or by borrowing money. So in the next few slides, we'll be looking at the role of deficit financing, what are the adverse effects, and what are the remedial measures we can take. Now, firstly, in order to understand the deficit finance, we need to understand few of the deficit indicators. Now, we would like to focus on 4 indicators as budget deficit, revenue deficit, fiscal deficit, and primary deficit. Most of the time, we always talk about the fiscal deficit. So what is the difference between the budget deficit and fiscal deficit? And also to know primary deficit. So in order to understand that, we need to understand this diagram. So when the union budget or the state budget is presented, if we are talking of the country budget, the union budget, it is presented under 2 accounts. One account is known as the revenue account, the other account is known as the capital account. In your MBA curriculum, you will be going into the details of all these accounts in your financial accounting course and later on with the advanced courses of finance. Here we need to understand the basic concepts. So just to know what is a revenue account is, it is that account where the government is maintaining the money coming from taxes. Like you have corporate tax, you have income tax, you have indirect taxes, so even the GST. So all that is known as the revenue account. So we put all those transactions in the revenue account. And the capital account is connected with the assets. The assets the government has, for example, the government bonds. Maybe a simple example could be I have made these foreign embassies in different states. Like in Delhi, in Chanakyapuri, you have these foreign embassies where the ambassadors of other countries sit. So these are the assets. Similarly, you have done that in other countries outside India. So these are the assets. Anything to do with the assets, we put that in the capital account. So revenue account and capital account. So any revenue receipt, any money that is coming in is covered under revenue receipt, under the revenue account. Any expense that I am making in order to create the infrastructure to collect taxes, so that expenditure will be under the revenue expenditure account, under the revenue account. Similarly, for capital account, the receipts would be in the capital account receipts and the expenditure would be in capital account expenditure. So this is the overall framework under which the union budget is presented. Now, when we talk about the budget deficit, what is a budget deficit? Budget deficit is nothing when we take the total expenditure in both the accounts, revenue as well as capital account, minus the total receipts. So what I do is, if you look at this revenue expenditure plus capital account expenditure minus the revenue receipt and the capital account receipt. So that becomes my budget deficit, the total budget deficit. Then comes your revenue deficit. As we say revenue deficit, so we just consider the revenue account. So revenue expenditure minus the revenue receipt. So basically in a way we are saying all the money that comes from the taxes mostly. So revenue deficit, and then we come to the fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is the total expenditure minus the total receipt. Now the difference between the budget deficit and fiscal deficit is, so we had financed the deficit. Okay, so that means we have borrowed the money, or we are planning to borrow the money. So what we do is the total receipts, that means all the money that is coming to us, except the borrowings, except the borrowed money, that is the fiscal deficit. So that clearly indicates this is the total expense we are going to make, and this is the total receipts that we are going to get except the borrowings. So that is the real picture which is given by the indicator, which is fiscal deficit. Now fourth is the primary deficit. Primary deficit is the fiscal deficit minus the borrowings you have already done, maybe last year or prior to last year. Over the years you have done the borrowings. On that borrowings you are paying some interest. So every year you are paying the interest on those borrowings. So primary deficit gives me the clear picture where I take the total expenditure minus the total receipt minus the borrowings and minus the interest payments. So that gives me the clear picture as to how much money is coming and how much I am spending without any borrowings or the interest. And the final one, which is on the revenue deficit. So we talked about revenue deficit. Effective revenue deficit is revenue deficit minus the grants for creation of those capital assets. So any grants that I've given which is not going to come back to create those capital assets. So that is the effective revenue deficit. So these are the 5 things you should keep in mind. Most important would be the fiscal deficit and the primary deficit. The fiscal deficit without borrowings, primary deficit without borrowings and without interest payments. Now let us look at the fiscal deficit for the last 10 years. So we are talking of the total expenditure minus the total receipt minus the borrowings. That is my fiscal deficit. So rather than talking about a fixed quantity, that is in terms of the fixed amount of money, what we do is we represent this as percentage of GDP, because that is the real reflection of your fiscal deficit. So if we say in general, India's general government fiscal deficit is above the norms, which are the global norms for the emerging markets, and it is a worry for last few years. If I take it for the last 10 years from 2009 to 2019, so from 6.4 we have come down to 3.4. These are actuals I'm talking, which is good. But with this pandemic, this is going to go up. So we'll see that, because you need to help the businesses and the country growth requires those borrowings. Now, what has been the trend in the deficit? Now, if I talk of fiscal deficit, so it is from 3.4, 2021 we are thinking 3.5, so which is going to go up. And if I talk of the primary deficit, so even if I remove the interest payments, so it is going to be 0.4. and this is percentage of GDP. So fiscal and primary, they are related. So revenue deficit, just of the revenue account, so we are going up. Right? So from 2.4 to 2.7. So these are from the taxes. This deficit is increasing, which is not a good sign. And effective revenue deficit, which is when you say effective revenue deficit, what it means is minus the grants for creating those assets. So revenue deficit minus the grants. So, but obvious, this will also go up from 1.4 to 1.8. So that is going more. So that means this revenue deficit is increasing. So in a way, the debt is increasing. So effects of fiscal deficit, if we have to look at, so there are more problems than the benefits. It is not that I'm borrowing the money and my country is having a good GDP and there is growth, but there are more problems also. So number one is increase in national debt. For how long you keep on taking the debt and for how long you are going to pay the debt interest. So it is not only the national debt but also the interest payments. And also the future tax rises, because today you are taking it. If you are unable to come out of that trap, then you have no other way than to increase the tax rate and spending cuts. So there is another phenomenon which is going to happen, which is known as the crowding out. So when you are borrowing, the government is borrowing more and putting more money in the market. So as a result, the private sector is not going to invest because government is doing it. So the private sector is crowded out. So which is not a good sign, because the effectiveness and the efficiency of the resources is better with the private sector than in the government sector. So the return on investment is less. So as a result, when you're crowding out the private sector, so in a way the GDP is affected. So as a result, the potential inflation will be there, right? So the aggregate demand is going to increase. So may cause higher bond yields. So that is another problematic area. And if we talk of the benefits, so the increased aggregate demand, and as a result, because there is more money in the market, which we discussed, so on one side for the period, so it is good, so there will be the GDP growth, but it is going to make use of surplus savings in recession. So during the recession, when there are savings, so it is going to use that, so which is a good thing. Automatic stabilizers, because you are pumping more money in the market, so it will stabilize any recessionary trends. And finance public sector investment. So public sector investment goes up, so more money is available for the businesses to grow. So in nutshell, when we talk about the deficit financing, so the good part is it is going to improve the infrastructure for the economy, because there is money and there are projects by the government where employment goes up, infrastructure becomes better. But the negative side is rising cost of assets. So how to take remedial measures against the deficit? So as simple, you need to either increase the revenue or reduce the expenditure or work on both. So some of the measures which governments do take: disinvestment of public sector enterprises, which we discussed in the last lesson. Reform in the tax structure. We try to bring more people in the tax net, and also we try to tax more rich than more poor. We try to reduce the public expenditure, and we try to increase the duties and taxes on imported and domestic goods, and we try to curb the black money, because that is never accounted for in any of these accounts. Another thing we need to do is to analyze the budget. So if we look at the Union Budget 2021, so how to analyze? So generally the budget is presented in two ways. That is your revenue from where the money comes from, and expenditure where the money goes. So in the budget they try to tell you that. So one of the charts which they give you is, if I take my total money which is coming in is 1 rupee. So how the rupee comes. So like for example 20 paisa comes from the borrowings, the money that we borrow. And the corporation tax which I put on the corporates gives me 18 paisa, income tax 17 paisa, customs 4 paisa. So excise duty is 7 paisa, GST, which is very recent phenomenon, 18 paisa. Non-tax revenue which comes from other sources, 10 paisa. Non-debt capital receipts are 6 paisa. So if you look prominently, two things here. One is around 50% of your money comes from the borrowings and the GST. So that is a big thing here. Similarly, where the money goes, very important to know. So if it is 1 rupee, including the borrowings, so if you look at 10 paisa is other expenditure, pensions 6 paisa, subsidies 6 paisa, defense 8 paisa, centrally sponsored schemes 9 paisa, finance commission and other transfers 10 paisa, central sector schemes 13 paisa, interest payments 18 paisa, and state share of taxes and duties is 20 paisa. The most prominent, around 50%, comes from the interest payments that we pay, goes, not comes, it goes, and the state share which we give, like for the GST and other taxes that we collect, so that goes to the states. So around 38 is what that is, 38% goes there. So if I include what I say, the finance commission and other transfers, so that becomes then 50%. Now if we look at the fiscal deficit, so the other part of the budget, how you analyze is, you look at all the receipts and the expenditure accounts. So then you compare it with the earlier years. So from 2018 to 2020, how it has been going. So revenue receipts, they have gone up, which is a good thing. So in 18, 19, and then 19, 20, you see around 15.52 lakh crores to 20.20 lakh crores, which is an increase. Capital receipts have also gone up from 7 lakhs to 10 lakhs almost. So the total receipts have gone up by 7 lakh crores, which is a good thing. And the total expenditure has also gone up. You see, total receipts around 7 lakh increase, but your total expense also has gone up by 7 lakh crores, which is not a good thing. So in a way, you're not doing much. So although you're pumping in more money in terms of the expenditure for the growth, for the GDP growth, but at the same time you need to look at the deficit figure, and which is, if it is going down, that's a nice thing, from 6.8 to 3.4, which is nice. So if you can keep it to 1 to 2%, that's the best scenario. So the revenue deficit, as we have seen, is around 6 lakh crores. Now this is in the figures, not as percentage of GDP. So it is around 6 lakh crores. Effective revenue deficit is, so if I take the interest payments, the grant for creating the assets, then it is 4. So the grants is around 3 lakh crores. And if I talk of fiscal deficit, so that is around 7 lakhs. So as the increase was 7 lakhs, so that is good. So the primary deficit, so fiscal deficit is without the borrowings, and the primary deficit is without the interest. So that means a lot of money goes into the interest, because it is just around 1 lakh crores, whereas the fiscal deficit is around 8 8 lakhs. So around 7 lakhs is going into your interest payments, which is huge. So if I look at as percentage of GDP and I compare the last 3 years, so if I look at the chart below, what I see is the fiscal deficit, which is 3.5, and primary deficit 0.4, as we saw around 7 lakh crore is going into the interest payments. So that is the primary deficit. So huge difference there, around 3.1 of GDP. 3.1 of GDP is going into your interest payments. So that means huge borrowings in the past. So the revenue deficit has gone up 2.7. So in the revenue account from the taxes, the deficit is going up. Not a good thing. Effective revenue deficit is 1.8, has to go up. So the revenue deficit going up to 2.7 is again a worry. Now if we look at the global economy, which is going to shrink around 3%, and these are some of the projections made by IMF and other agencies, how India and other countries are going to do. So if you look at India in 2020, so the GDP projection is 1.9, but in 21 they feel it will go back to 7.4, but you never know. So if you look by different organizations, what has been given is like World Bank is 1.5 to 2. So these are the projections. If we look at the world, so it is going to shrink by 3%, which is what, and but then it is going to grow in 21 to 5.8. If you look at US minus 5.9, which is huge. Russia minus 5.5. Brazil, so Europe minus 7.5. China, if you look at 1.2, but then it is going to go to 9.2, the highest GDP growth over there. So these are some of the projections as where the global scenario is. So that is all, my friends. So let me summarize the things for you. We talked about the deficit financing, we talked about the indicators, and then we talked about the trends and effects and what are the remedial measures we can take to reduce the deficit. And then we looked at how to analyze the budget, and we talked about 2021 Union Budget for India. So here is a small quiz for you. What is the primary deficit? Second question, how to finance the excess expenditure? And taxes come under which account? So what is a primary deficit? Primary deficit is nothing but fiscal deficit minus the interest payments. How can you finance the excess expenditure? Either by printing money or borrowings or both. Taxes come under which account? It is the revenue account. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask me and I'll revert back to you. If you go for any further reading, especially on the union budget, this is a good place to go in. This is the website which talks about the complete analysis of Union Budget 2021. Worth going and reading it. Thank you very much. See you next time with the next lesson. Goodbye for now. Shabba khair.